Context feels like a basic entry point for coming to grips with historical literature, right? If a book is 5 years old, you could probably get most of the cultural references made in it. If a book is 50 years old, you might need some help. But if a book is 500 years old or more, you might even need a translation. Hi, I'm Dr. Gavin Davis, and in this video I want to take a long look at a short question: how old is Beowulf? Because the answer is, we don't really know. You see, understanding a story's historical context tells us what inspirations a work was drawing on and what significance a work had for its original audience. But the problem with a lot of medieval, and especially Old English literature, is that it's tough to pin down exactly when a work was composed, making it difficult to answer some of even the most basic questions about even familiar pieces of literature. Beowulf makes an excellent case study in how much we can know about something we don't know much about. Still, I think the more valuable lesson is figuring out how we can manage to make precise scholarly claims and have a meaningful relationship with a story whose original context is uncertain. Look, I get that we're not really calling it the Dark Ages anymore, but there really are some things we're just not sure of. Let's start with what we do know and work backwards from there. This is the Beowulf manuscript, which is currently kept in the British Library in London. It is written in Old English, and it is the only surviving copy of Beowulf from the Middle Ages. There's no other copies or editions, no mass print runs or other records of Beowulf's existence from the Middle Ages. It's just this, and the bare few details that can be pulled together from its context. In other words, whatever other copies of Beowulf existed, either written or oral, before this one, are lost. And this is all that remains, which it barely did itself when the library it was housed in caught fire in 1731. Fortunately, it's actually not too hard to tell when this manuscript was created. Scholars who specialize in handwriting have been able to identify two distinct hands that worked on the Beowulf manuscript. Handwriting of this period followed really specific styles, which can be given date ranges based on when they were popular. The handwriting of one scribe is called square minuscule, and it has no record of really being used after the year 1010. The other handwriting, called English vernacular minuscule, is first known to have been used about the year 1001. This means that we can be pretty sure that the Beowulf manuscript was probably created by these two scribes somewhere between 1001 and 1010. So, roughly the first decade of the 11th century, plus or minus a few years. All this to say, this manuscript is old, and we're really lucky to have this manuscript, which has survived 1,000 years for us to be able to study today. But this is just the starting point, really, because this is just when the story was written down, right? Like, this copy of Beowulf was printed in 2000, but that doesn't mean that's when Beowulf was written. The scribes who made the only surviving Beowulf manuscript were probably working from an older copy that is now lost. So 1010 may be about when the only surviving medieval copy of Beowulf was written down, but when was this version of Beowulf first composed? Beowulf's date of composition is like a holy grail of Old English scholarship. It is both super desirable and yet really difficult to get, if at all. Because of this, the precise date has been the subject of intense debate and controversy amongst Old English scholars for some time. It is tempting to assume that Beowulf is closer in age to the legendary Migration era period in which the poem is set. This might even be attractive since, well, it would be cool if Beowulf was in fact really, really old. And some of the earliest editors of Beowulf made that mistake. Never mind that the poem is heavily influenced by Christianity, which didn't make its way to Beowulf's corner of Europe until a fair bit later. The precise date of composition is what we would call a contested subject. Scholars will argue about it, reach a consensus, and then challenge that consensus as it's popular to do so, or as new scholarship or evidence appears. Throughout much of the 20th century, scholarship coalesced around the late 7th, early 8th century for a variety of reasons that had a lot of popular pull. In the 1980s, scholarship advanced and challenged a lot of earlier assumptions and landed on a much later date for Beowulf. This occurred at a big conference of Old English experts in Toronto. It was called the Toronto Conference, and it was like a big deal, lots of academic drama. This conference argued for a later date of composition, perhaps not too far removed from the manuscript itself, and they really tried to push against an early 8th century reading. And, like, to me, this consensus from the 1980s strikes me as one grounded in a healthy degree of criticism for popular attitudes, even if it was a bit cynical. But this was the dating I was taught when I was in undergrad. Since then, though, this later dating of Beowulf has been fairly systematically challenged, and scholarship has once again coalesced on an early 8th century date for Beowulf, so about 700 to 750 or so, based off of linguistic evidence that works really hard to date when certain ways of writing came into and out of practice. This linguistic evidence is in turn corroborated by archaeological and cultural evidence. If you would like to see some sources, here they are. Now, linguistic evidence can be tough to work with, especially when later poets really did like to emulate older styles of poetry. On top of that, cultural and historical evidence can again be really tricky to work with, considering that we just really don't have that much to go off of. Trying to pin down dates in this particular period of literature really can feel like grasping at straws. However, some of this newer kind of linguistic analysis that has come out is pretty crunchy. Like, scholarship has improved over the last century, and call me an optimist, the methodologies people make these arguments with are held to a higher and higher standard of scholarly practice all the time. So while this isn't the academic hill I'm going to die on, it's reasonable to say that the Beowulf poem, as we know it, was probably composed in the first half of the 8th century, between 700 and 750, and we can be reasonably confident in this until some new evidence is brought to light. So that settles it. The Beowulf manuscript is 1,025 years old, being created about the year 1000. The poem itself comes more or less from about the beginning of the 8th century, making it about 1,300 years old, give or take. But is that how old Beowulf is? We're all familiar with the sense of what a legend is, right? It's an old story that we know the gist of, even if we've never heard the original authoritative version. Well, it turns out that's awfully close to the specific technical definition used in scholarship to define the kind of story that Beowulf is. A traditional story, sometimes popularly regarded as historical, but not authenticated. A fable, a myth. And this from the Oxford English Dictionary. You see, Beowulf doesn't exactly stand on its own in that it was part of a tradition of poetry that dealt with quasi-historical figures set in what was, even for the medieval poets, their legendary past. For lack of a better term, scholars call these poems the Germanic legends in that they were written in the Germanic languages, and we believe they might have been relatively popular since the surviving ones reference the same set of characters and events. But here's the thing. Of the supposedly popular English Germanic legendary tradition, only 5 works survive today. 2 short poems, 2 fragments, and Beowulf, which means that we're pretty sure there was a much larger set of stories that the original audience of Beowulf would have been familiar with, even though we barely know what any of those stories are. Now, Beowulf himself is only mentioned in the Beowulf poem, so there is the possibility that Beowulf was original to the poem and not a part of this larger legendary cycle. But these other legends mention figures from Beowulf, and Beowulf itself mentions these other legends. That's what all those allusions to other battles and histories are. They're like cameo references or name drops to other characters that add value to this story, even as they corroborate the existence of this larger legendarium. And some of these quasi-historical characters, like Hygelac and his death in A Raid Gone Bad, can be roughly dated to as early as the 6th century. So it is just as likely that Beowulf was also a figure from earlier legends we don't have. And at the very least, Beowulf is somehow descended from an oral storytelling tradition in which stories were composed, memorized, and retold orally before they were ever written down. But again, we don't have any of these lost legends. So even though it is perfectly reasonable to expect that the character of Beowulf has been around for a lot longer than the early 8th century, we have to accept the fact that we can't be certain where Beowulf's story first came from, even if it is tantalizing to imagine that it is old. So, what does this all mean? Can't we just be happy that we know when the manuscript was made and have a pretty good idea of when the poem was composed? Well, yeah, but I think there are three key points that I want to highlight that I think are really important for the study of ancient literature like this. First, the spread of dates from Beowulf's manuscript creation to its legendary origins represents an enormous span of time in which the medieval world became a very different place. At the year 1000, English culture is pretty thoroughly Christianized and not too far away from events like chivalric culture, Romance literature, and the Crusades that would characterize what would be known as the High Middle Ages. 750, though, was before King Alfred, Charlemagne, or even the Viking Age, and the poem's Christian elements may have been viewed as a lot more cutting edge. The poem's legendary origins in the 6th century, though, are even then a hazy memory of an entirely different pre Christian world for whom the fall of the Western Roman Empire was a relatively recent occurrence. All this to say, by the time the manuscript was created in 1010, the Beowulf story was, for them, already really old. It would be like if in 1,000 years from now, this person in the future read your telling of the arrival of the Mayflower. This is because about 400 years separates us from the European colonization of the Americas, and about 400 years separates the Beowulf manuscript from the legendary period in which the story is set. Second, the complexity of assigning a date to Beowulf highlights the important scholarly practice of acknowledging just how much we don't know, and to think carefully about how that affects the kinds of claims that we can make about a historical text. For example, apparently one of the earliest scholars to read Beowulf was like, aha, yes, whoever wrote this was definitely an eyewitness at Beowulf's funeral. We can't make those kinds of claims. We don't know who wrote it or really even when it was written, and these are the basic pieces of information we need to know to be able to make any kind of claim about a work's immediate context. And if you make any positive claim about when Beowulf was composed, you better believe that some scholar will be willing to take you to task over it. So, as much as it would be cool if Beowulf was a contemporary eyewitness account of what life was like in an early medieval pre-Christian feasting hall, whatever Beowulf is, it's not that. But we can still make some limited claims that are worthwhile. For example, when I wrote my dissertation on swords as significant cultural objects in 10th century literature, I used Beowulf as an example since, regardless of when it was written, we know that it was at least somewhat significant in the 10th century since it was worth the enormous trouble of copying down into a gorgeous new manuscript. The existence of the Beowulf manuscript, with its magical swords and monster fights, means that it was an important work of literature in the Middle Ages, at least to somebody in the early 11th century. Finally, and this is entirely subjective, is there almost a kind of beauty to these origins being lost to time? I ask this as a question since this has more to do with each of our personal connections with these stories. Sure, it would be awesome to know when Beowulf was composed, and if I could, I certainly would like to know. Who knows, maybe the discovery of the original manuscript or the hilts of Hrunting would make for a good Indiana Jones movie. But look, I got into medieval literature because to me, there is something inescapably mysterious about the Middle Ages. And this is especially the case when the origins of the medieval story are lost into the mists of history, to use a cliche. Once we accept that we just don't know some things, stuff that will forever belong only to those in the past, and stop trying to fill the voids with useless conjecture, it feels humbling. Like these stories were a part of something bigger than me, and bigger than even the full force of academic study can comprehend. So there you have it. When was Beowulf written? The manuscript's from the early 11th century. The poem is from the early 8th century, probably. And the rest is a great, big, beautiful mystery. As always, thanks for joining me in this discussion. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the mysterious origins of Beowulf in the comments below. If you want to know where I got a lot of this information, I just posted a video comparing different editions of Beowulf that you can see at the link on the screen. If medieval stories with swords in them are interesting to you, be sure to like and subscribe. This channel is just getting going, and I've got a lot more content on Beowulf, Tolkien, and the literature of the Middle Ages lined up for you. Until then, I'm Gavin the Medievalist, and I'll see you next time.